This meeting is being recorded.
Good, thank you. Hi, my name is Yuksel Serindag, and I am a librarian by profession. And my guest and friend, Professor Stan Thangaraj, I hope that I pronounce your name correctly. Professor Thangaraj, or Stan, is Professor James E. Hayden Chair for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Social Justice, and Professor of Anthropology and Sociology at Stonehill College in Easton, Massachusetts. His upcoming book examines the Kurdish diasporas in Nashville, and his recent article, "We Share the Same Ancestry, U.S. Kurdish Diasporas and the Aspirational Ascriptive Practices of Race," won the Association for Asian American Studies Social Science Outstanding Faculty Research Article Award. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
This topic that we're going to talk about, I named Kurdish Amerikanjis. We call them Amerikanjis, but not Kurdish, just Amerikanjis, is about the first Kurdish immigration to the US more than a century ago. Thousands of Kurds came to the US from one specific area. Stan, when I met you in Washington, DC, I was in at the conference, at the Middle Eastern Studies Conference, yearly conference in Washington, DC a few years ago, or more than a few years ago. So you were presenting something about the Kurds in Nashville. So then it happened that I raised my hand and said that the Kurds came way before the Nashville Kurds. That was that's because I knew that, because a lot of people from my area, and including my grandfather, maternal grandfather, and his brother came to the US. My grandfather obviously returned, but he stayed, the brother stayed here. So we would like to talk about that. It's going to be, the topic is probably going to be something new for some Kurdish viewers, of the Kurds living in the US, or just Kurds in general, because they don't probably know about it. I bet some of them don't even know that the Kurds came a century ago, thinking that the Kurdish area is an enclosed area, does not have a sea, or is not on the sea, does not have this maritime relations with other nations, so that they know about other places, other areas on the planet. So from this enclosed and mostly mountainous area of Kurdistan, of Ottoman Kurdistan. So they came from that area all the way crossing the Atlantic. So it's going to be a fascinating topic, or is a fascinating topic for people who are living here in the United States. And I hope it's going to be also interesting for anyone viewing this recording. I would like to start with the beginnings, and it's going to be a brief Kurdish history immigration to the United States. The information I gathered, I collected, is mostly from a specific person that we both know about, is Frank Ahmed. His father came also from this area, and he wrote about his father and how they came to the US, and his book is written in 1980s, and he was also in the State Department. When I talked to him years ago, 30 years ago, he had worked at the State Department in Turkey. I mean, at the embassy in Turkey, American embassy in Turkey, but he did not know anything about the Kurds. I talked to him specifically. At the time, the Iraqi Kurds were coming to the Turkish-Iraqi border. I asked also about them, whether he knew about anything about them. He said, no, he doesn't know anything about them. Some people, just Iraqis, are coming, escaping Saddam's bombardments. He did not know anything about the Kurds. Even in his book, he doesn't rarely mentions Kurds. Only someone who wrote the preface says about the Kurds. Someone else, okay, mentions the Kurds. And okay, back to his book, he says that approximately 300,000 immigrants came to the United States from the Ottoman Turkey between 1900 to 1920s. I have a mistake here, sorry, 1900 to 1920s, should be 1920s, according to the US immigration records. Within this number, 45 to 65,000 Muslim Turks, including Turks and Kurds. The largest number of Anatolians, he says, who set out for America came from neighboring villages or towns of Harput, nowadays Elazığ, the city and the region of Elazığ, Dersim, Cabakçur, nowadays Bingöl, my hometown, Siverek, and the other cities, Rize, Samsun, Giresun, are Turkish, northern Black Sea towns. But most of the people there, among these immigrants, they were from Elazığ, Dersim, Cabakçur area, so mostly Kurds. I say that because another person, a writer, Server Tanelli, who wrote also his memoirs, when he came to the United States during the War of the Turks in early 20th century, between 1918 and then 23, just before the founding of the Republic. He came to collect funding, money, to support the Turkish war in Anatolia. He went to Detroit. He says in his memoirs that most of the Turks in Detroit were Kurds. That's from Servet Tanelli.
This is also where, Yuksel, I think it's really, really important to also mention that the emergence of Islam in Dearborn and the establishment of the mosque, that the work of the incredible work of Sally Howell shows us that Kurds and Turks were some of the key players in the emergence of Islam in Dearborn. And so we always understand Islam as somehow coming through the Arab workers from Syria and from Lebanon, but that is not accurate. It was actually the key role of Kurds and Turks in forming Muslim spaces in Dearborn that led to the formation of the first mosque, the expansion of the community, creation of a Muslim brotherhood and an infrastructure of support, right? And so that was absolutely pivotal in creating spaces for other immigrants from the Ottoman Empire to come, whether they were Muslim or not. And also some of the earlier waves of Kurds that came to the US were actually in the late 1800s as well. Some who came as individuals on ships, that smuggled themselves onto ships and came. Some that came through various operations like sailing operations and shipping companies, but also when they served other military purposes. So for me, as someone who's trained as an anthropologist of Asian America, I always imagined the starting point of Asian American history as 1965, when the US opened its borders to a wide assortment of people from Asia. But then work by like Vivek Bald shows that, and Vivek Bald and Su Cheng Chan show that there's a much earlier history of Asian Americans and South Asian Americans in the US. And as we see this movement, I think that's where Sally Howell's work, and like this is where you made the most incredible intervention when I presented at the Mesa conference to force me to think about Kurdish history that predates the 1970 arrival of the Kurds in Iraq, right? And that's where, as we think about Kurdish studies, we have to think about Kurdish histories that are beyond the histories of large ethnic enclaves. Like the ethnic enclaves are so visible, we imagine that as the starting point. But there are these much smaller groups, but also larger groups of Kurds that came, but were stuck with the Ottoman Empire passports and were understandable in our census forms and in our immigration forms as Turks. And also coming at a time during, the attack on Armenia and the ways in which the US had this anxiety about Christian brothers being attacked in Armenia. These Kurds also had to be strategic and position themselves in ways in which they weren't seen as Turks, or seen as Kurds who were attacking Armenians. So their very entry into US shores are not as clear and legible as in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, when the immigration data was much more accurate. And we had the category to understand them as Kurds in ways in which, like your grandfather's moved to the US and his work before he went back to Kurdistan, those categories were not legible. They weren't easily accessible.
It is interesting that in Ahmed Frank's book, he quotes a Salem newspaper or Salem Evening newspaper, that the Turks and Kurds went on strike. It's fascinating. Okay, in that article, the Kurds is spelled as C-U-R-D. Okay, not A-U. It's interesting. Okay, I love that. But then sociologically, when I think about it, these people came from rural areas, no working class, nothing. They didn't know anything about working class industrial relations and so on and so on. But they did go on strike, protesting or striking for better conditions. That's fascinating to me. But that means they were really influenced by working conditions, by probably other workers of other ethnic groups. Who knows? I don't know. I cannot say, or it's hard to say how. And most of them were illiterate.
Yes.
Okay? So
yes.
it's quite amazing. So how did the Kurds know about America? Because the center was Kharput. There were many foreign colleges, schools, okay, and American missionaries in Kharput, based in Kharput. French, German, American college, for example. It was American Armenian College, and then became later American Euphrates College, and so on and so on. So these people, the missionaries, because Harvard University has lots of documents, manuscripts, writings of the missionaries about these areas. They came there, American missionaries came there, in Kharput, Malatya. They were also involved with the Alevis, okay, Kurdish Alevis, because it was easier to have access to the surrounding areas of Kharput, or Kurdish Rayahat, known as Alevis. So I know that in the early 20th century, Kharput was the main economic center for our villages. Okay, so let's say you're selling your animals. We were, my grandparents, whatever, people there were mostly they were raising animals, sheep, goats, and so on and so on. Okay, so they would take the animals to Harput, sell them there, and then get other products. And also educational center. So Harput was the main, the center for everything, economic, cultural, whatever center. Okay, so educational center, intellectual center for the Kurds. So they then knew about America through the missionaries or the American schools founded in Harput. There is one, I would like to show the area. So this is Harput area, and the surrounding areas, Bingöl, Dersim, Jabahchur, and Harput, they all came from this area. And they went to Trabzon, which is a port city. From there, they boarded French ships, okay, according to French ship to Istanbul, Constantinople at the time, and to Marseille. For many times, they waited a long time in Marseille. And then from Marseille to Ellis Island. But he says that most of the Kurds came to New England through Providence, Rhode Island, not Ellis Island, okay? Via the ports in Providence, Rhode Island. And then they went to other places such as Salem, Boston, where the tannery industry was flourishing and other industry. They worked in those areas. So Frank Ahmed's family lived in Salem, Massachusetts. But in the 70s, one of my relatives came to Bingöl, and his Kurdish name was Rasule Ali, Russell Ali's son. But it was interesting. The name was changed to Russell Allen. How appropriate, okay? How appropriate. I love that. Just Russell Allen. It fits perfectly. So no big change there in a way. And there is a beautiful recording on the before the travel of the Kurds to Trabzon, to the port city of Trabzon, and from there to Istanbul.
And this is where I think, Yuksel, I think it's so important that you are showing this movement and trajectory of like the men from your village at that historical moment. What we have to understand about that historical moment is this is also one of the times of massive industrialization and the creation and expansion of industries by the colonial powers across the world, right? And so what France actually did was it started building a massive shipping industry, and Marseille was the center of that. And so Rhonda Tavo is a brilliant scholar, a historian, and scholar of gender and sexuality studies at TCU that examines that. And I think this is where it's really vital for us to understand that industrialization is also prevalent in the West because of Kurdish and Turkish presence, right? That there's a much longer presence of us that makes this possible. And I'll stay quiet while the video goes on.
No, it's okay. So this is the scene, a few minutes about the Kurds leaving Harput, but it's in Turkish. So the documentary is in Turkish. This is the city or town of Harput.
Bu merak uyandıran hikayenin ve yaşananları, görüntüleri arşivlerden çıktı. 1800'lerin sonu, 1900'lerin başında Amerika'ya uğurlanan insanların görüntüleri büyük yankı uyandıracak şekilde.
Yeah, and these videos just show, the types of complexity of lives back in Harput, but also how that is really vital to understand how these young men, specifically men, right? Like we don't hear stories yet of women traveling, in which I think as we engage more in history, we will find these glimpses here and there. And I think what this shows us is how the story of industrialization in the US is not possible without immigrant labor, right? And that is what we see with Dearborn and the expansion of Ford production, and then in Butte, Montana with the copper mine rush, and all throughout Pennsylvania and West Virginia with the coal mine rush. There were not enough labor to sustain American industrialization. And thus our borders were opened for people from across the world, but especially we see such an increase of people during this historical moment through the relationship the US had with the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, it's when they came back. We just when they came back, I mean, some of them stayed, some of them came back because when they heard about, because our area was occupied partially by Russians, a lot of families moved to the central parts of Anatolia, to Malatya, to Konya, or to western part of Kurdistan. So probably some of them came back because they heard that the families, that the relatives had left the villages because of the Russian occupation. So they had come back. But some of them came back because they had wives and children. Because one, in one story, there is one, I had already mentioned this relative of mine, he came through Ellis Island. This is a record from archives. It says Russell Allen, minor, from Turkey, and that's it. So no kids, nothing else. Okay, and then he died in West Virginia. He lived in West Virginia. So there is a woman. Her name is Sıdıka Avar. She wrote a book on her memoirs. I mean, she wrote her memoirs on being principal of a young girls teaching college, okay, in Harput, in Elazığ. The Turkish government built a high school, boarding school for young girls. And the title of the book is Benim Dağ Çiçeklerim, My Mountain Flowers. And the name of the author is Sıdıka Avar. So, and she was partially educated in the US. She brought the same mentality, this colonial mentality, to the Kurdish areas. She would go, if you read, unfortunately it's in Turkish. First of all, she wants to civilize the Kurdish women, civilize the mentality, the ideology she learned in the US, okay? Probably because she attended a home economics institute. I don't know much about how the missionaries in the US, okay, educated or assimilated forcefully the native boys or girls, okay? So I don't know much about it. So, but I guess, this is my guess, how she must have applied the same methods, okay? She went to the villages in my area, in Bingöl, Dersim, Elazığ, and she collected girls, took them, and brought them to the boarding school. This here, it's an excerpt. When I read the book it was quite interesting. And she comes to this village, Azdapert, now is a township of Bingöl. We belong to this township. She doesn't know Kurdish, and no one in the village knows Turkish. This is 50s. Still, Turkish is not widespread at all. Is not a language in Kurdistan. Yeah, okay. She doesn't know how to communicate with the people, how to take away their girls or daughters or sisters, okay? She sees a radio in the village head, in the house of the village head, okay? So all of a sudden, she says, "Hey, radio," in American accent. And the muhtar, the head of the village, said, "Yes, ma'am." He also, okay? So being in America, he was in America, he came back, okay, he says, "Yes, ma'am." So, and then she asks the muhtar, the village head, in English, "Do you know English?" And he says, "Yes, ma'am." But he knows English. And they communicate in English, not in Turkish.
Yeah, and and this is just so fascinating that you bring up this particular instance, Yuksel, because this is also at a time where, like, often the story of Kurds and people from the MENA and Swana region are often thought of through only European colonization. But here, what we see is actually the ways in which U.S. imperialism in the late 1800s really starts to take shape and has this impact in the early 1900s in Kurdistan, right? One way, the ways in which Christianity, through the missionaries and capitalism and the explosion of industry, take place through this U.S. imperial logic of spreading American culture, spreading American democracy, right? Again, which is often grounded in these colonial views of women from the global South as always in need of saving, right? And to be educated and to be helped. And I think, like, your story and your engagement is such an important historical interjection into how we think about the region in very simplistic terms. Here we see both the movement of Kurds, that Kurds have always been incredibly mobile, right? And it is not something that's new post 1970s, but this is the history of Kurds, is also a history of migration and mobility that also occurs at the same time with the expansion and mobility of colonialism and US imperialism, right? And so it is this point where, as we start thinking about this historical moment that you're actually asking us to focus on, it is a moment of where you see the colliding forces of Kurdish migration, Kurdish mobility, changing structure of the Ottoman Empire, US imperialism, and the slowly fading of the European colonial project, right? All of these things intersect in complex and contradictory ways, that there is not one story to Kurdish migration to the US, right? And you're asking us to really destroy this simplistic, monolithic way to imagine Kurdish migration. And so that's where we are asked to focus, because of these histories you mentioned. We have to be really attentive to the larger frames of analysis of US empire, Turkish nation state formation, right? As well as US geopolitical practices that have led to the opening of borders at particular times.
There is not much information about the Kurdish-Turkish relations. Probably they were together since they came from the same area. Ottoman Turkey and so on. So since people, some of them returned and some of them stayed, and they just assimilated themselves into the society and didn't continue that tradition or being together or preserving the Kurdish culture and so on and so on, didn't somehow was not in their minds, I guess, right? So it's not just they survived. What do you think? I mean, how would you study that? There is no historical, there is no information about them. Okay, so but you met also people, descendants of these people, right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And I love that point. And I think this is where we have to start thinking, systematically about the longer histories, where most of the folks who are Turks and Kurds who came on Ottoman Empire passports went back home. But that's not the case with the Syrians and Lebanese that came on Ottoman Empire passports. They decided in large numbers to stay and establish communities all throughout the US, right? They worked as peddlers, they worked as garment makers, they worked, in various types of industry. And what we have is we have to look at the ways in which where you don't have a Kurdish enclave, as we do in Nashville in the 1970s onwards, in late 1800s US and early 1900s US, with a small number of Kurds that stay and marry white women, right? And that they're very conscious that they can fall into the categories of whiteness to be able to marry white women in ways in which Afghans at this time were not able to. Right. And so what this meant was you already see a shift in expanding alliance where Kurds, because of the large presence of Lebanese Christians, are working systematically with the Lebanese community, that the Lebanese communities become a really central point in Butte, Montana, in creating job opportunities, in creating societies that impact and support people from the Ottoman Empire. And so for Kurds to be pulled into the Assyrian colony, as the Lebanese concentrated area in Butte was known, which then became the Syrian colony, which then over time became the Lebanese colony, because people finally understood self-identification versus how the US native imagined that region, right? So Kurds grew up in the Lebanese colony, but they saw the ways in which the Lebanese provided their own mutual aid society and created a vibrant cultural center, a Lebanese cultural center in Butte, Montana. And that became a very clear emblem for the Kurd, Aladdin Hussein, who then,
That's the one.
he sets up, owns first works at the Constantinople Cafe, then becomes an owner, and then changes the name to Istanbul Cafe. And what the cafe then does is what the Lebanese cultural centers and what the strong Lebanese community do, which is it provides a vital means of support for Kurdish and Turkish workers in Butte, Montana. So the cafe became a site of residence where people could live and pay rent, or be able to pay a much smaller rent to Hussein to live there. And because you weren't always paid in money through the copper mining companies, you were paid in bonds, you needed someone to secure and take care of the bonds. And Hussein became the pivotal player in helping manage the accounts and finances of both Kurds, Turks, and other Muslims in Butte, Montana.
If you remember, we looked at a few photos with you. We examined the photos. It was interesting it was interesting to notice that Turkish nationalism was very strongly somehow portrayed in these pictures. And that means the Turkish nationalist ideals or ideas go back to the very early 20th century, 1890s, 1900. Okay, so that propaganda must have been very strong in that time across the ethnic groups in the Ottoman Empire, because with the pictures of Genghis Khan styles clothing, and so I saw that in those pictures. That is a sign of Turkish nationalism, right-wing Turkish nationalism in Turkey. Okay, they pretend that Genghis Khan, etc., were their forefathers. Mm-hmm. That's even people coming to the US, to America, and that ideology was even brought here and kept here. Okay, and same thing when I compare that with the immigrants to Germany. The Kurdish immigrants went to Germany in the 60s, but it was the 70s that Kurdish national identity became somehow prevalent among the Kurds. Okay, so about Kurdishness, the Kurdishness, their Kurdishness came out in the 70s, very late, not early. So it's quite interesting.
And
anything else you want to add before we close our talk? I think.
Well, I also want to mention that what you're mentioning is so absolutely vital, Yuksel, which is we can't forget that even ethnic others in a nation also embody the very systems of nationalism that might alienate them, because that becomes their most viable means of being visible, to make sense of themselves, especially in a foreign land where they feel new sets of exclusion, new sets of marginalization. Turkish nationalism becomes a way to connect with others, right? But we also have to be very clear that because we also have a large Lebanese community and systematic, media coverage of Muslims in the MENA region and in Turkey as the danger and as the problem, we have Muslim support societies that start forming, where Kurds are now forming partnerships with Turks, Muslim Turks, and with Muslim others. And what we specifically see in the Midwest is, especially in Butte, Montana, is you have the presence of Eastern European Muslims who come to work, who create the Muslim Aid Society, to which, so the first Muslims in some of these mining areas are not people we in the US stereotype as Muslims, right? They're Eastern European, would pass as white, right? And so these Eastern Europeans, like Bosnian Muslims, create the Muslim support societies and mutual aid organizations that Aladdin Hussein then becomes a key member of. So for Muslim that dies in Butte, Montana, Aladdin and a couple of other Kurds and Turks are the ones who organize the services, the funeral rites, and
No, Aladdin is Sıdık Torun's cousin, right? Or relative?
Yes.
In California. So Sıdık.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So Sid Torun's grandfather came in 1894. And we're still trying to find that and trace that. And we have Aladdin Hussein coming almost more than a decade later in 1906. But this is so important for all of us who think about Kurdish history and Kurdish studies, to be very open to understanding the mistranslations and negotiations that take place at the point of immigration entry. Right, Ellis Island or in Providence or in San Francisco, right? What happens is we have English-speaking native-born white folks taking note of who these immigrant workers are. And they don't know how to spell the names. The immigrant workers, especially Kurds, who are not formally trained, who don't have high levels of literacy, and don't always have legal and census documents, emerge and come into the U.S. and they're at times picking names that the immigration port person gives them because they don't understand. Rasuli Ali says, "Oh, Russell Allen," right? And this is the same point where we have to think about how these names are negotiated between the state institutions of immigration and the immigrant. And that's why, like, the birth records and stuff, as we engage with Kurdish history across the West, especially in the US and Canada, it is that birthdays were also given at the point of entry. So for like the ship that Aladdin Hussein came, it arrived on July 15th.
Yeah.
And so for his birthday to be July 15th, as well as the people, many of the people he traveled with that he kept in touch with in Butte, Montana and Dearborn, it is not that there was this magical date to mate as a Kurdish couple that led to all these people being born on July 15th. So we have to really check into ship registries and immigration records to see that birthdays are not set, that they are negotiated. And we have to then, at this point, rewrite Kurdish histories that don't acknowledge birthdays as facts, as historical facts, but as process of interaction, as points of collision and points of negotiation.
Thank you. I think we could close now our talk with this. And thank you very much for the scientific academic approach. And I hope that this talk or this recording is going to be a valuable contribution to the Kurdish History Month. And thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. I'm so honored to spend any time and space with you, Yuksel. You are such an incredible contributor to Kurdish studies. And on this day, I also want to wish you and everyone that will watch this a happy Nowruz to all. And may we have much greater hope and possibility and light for social justice in 2023.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.